Okay, so you want to own a distillery. You can already see it. A brick building at the edge of a small town, maybe a converted warehouse with big arched windows and your name in iron letters over the door. Inside, the air is warm and sweet, thick with the smell of fermenting grain and toasted oak. There's a copper still in the middle of the room, tall as a two-story house, gleaming like a trophy, catching the afternoon light. You walk the rows of barrels stacked 6 high, and you run your hand along the wood, and every single one of them is quietly turning clear liquid into money while you sleep. There's a tasting room out front. People drive an hour to sit at your bar. They buy a bottle with your face on the story and your signature on the label, and they tell their friends they know the founder. You're not just making a product. You're making a legacy. Something with your name on it that outlives you. That's the picture. That's what the brand story and the glossy magazine profile and the Craft Revolution articles sell you. Here's the problem. That copper still you're picturing costs more than a house, and it will sit there producing nothing you can legally sell for years. The barrels aren't making you money while you sleep. They're losing money while you sleep, evaporating, quite literally, into the air. The tasting room is often the only part of the business making a profit, and it's the part everyone treats as an afterthought. And the whole beautiful operation runs on a bet you place today and can't collect on until half a decade from now, in a market you cannot predict, against giants who can make the exact same liquid for a fraction of your cost. So let me reframe the whole thing right now, because this is the sentence the rest of this video is built on. A whiskey distillery is not really a manufacturing business. It's not really a farming business either. It's a warehouse full of slowly aging inventory that you financed with today's money and can only sell with tomorrow's demand. It is a business that happens to have a still attached to it, but the still is not where the money is won or lost. The warehouse is. Read that again. By the end of this, you'll understand exactly where every dollar goes when you open a distillery, why the single most romantic part of the business is also the most financially brutal, how the money actually comes in and in what order, why one of the most awarded craft whiskey makers in America filed for bankruptcy while sitting on a warehouse full of excellent whiskey, and why the people who actually get rich in this industry are almost never the people you see on the label. We're going to walk through the real numbers, the entry cost, the hidden infrastructure, the operating bleed, the tax structure, and the boom and bust cycle that eats distilleries alive. Stick with me, because the mechanism at the center of this business is genuinely one of the strangest in any industry, and once you see it, you can't unsee it. But before we talk about money, we need to talk about what a distillery actually is. Because distillery is a single word covering at least 3 completely different businesses, and people constantly confuse them. Some distilleries make what's called unaged or lightly aged spirits. Gin, vodka, some rums, white whiskey, moonshine. These come off the still, get bottled, and get sold within days or weeks. The money moves fast. You spend on Monday, you can sell on Friday. This is, financially speaking, the safest lane. Some distilleries make aged brown spirits. Bourbon, rye, single malt whiskey, aged rum, brandy. This is the romantic one, the one you're picturing, and it operates on a completely different clock. You spend money today to make a liquid you are legally and practically forbidden from selling as a premium product until it has sat in a barrel for years. Bourbon that wants to call itself straight needs at least 2 years in the barrel. The stuff people actually pay top dollar for is usually 4, 6, 10, 12 years old. So you're funding today's production with today's cash, and you won't see the revenue from it until a version of you that's several years older finally rolls that barrel out. And some distilleries don't really distill at all, at least, not the whiskey they sell. They buy their spirit in bulk from a giant industrial distiller, put it in their own bottle with their own story, and sell it as craft. We'll come back to this, because it's central to the whole game. 3 businesses. One word. For the rest of this video, we're focusing on the second one, the aged whiskey distillery, because that's the dream everyone has, and it's the one where the economics are most misunderstood. So let's talk about the entry cost. What does it actually take to get in the door? Here's the first hard truth. You can start a tiny distillery for a few $100,000, and you can build a real, competitive, scalable whiskey brand for somewhere between $3 and $5 million. Those are not typos, and they're not my numbers. That 3 to 5 million figure is what industry consultants who build these brands for a living quote as the realistic minimum to create something that can actually compete rather than just exist. Where does that money go? The still itself, the beautiful copper centerpiece, typically runs somewhere between $100,000 and $400,000 for a professional system, depending on size and how much of it is automated. But the still is honestly one of the more predictable line items. It's everything around it that surprises people. And here's the lesson buried in that entry cost, the one that separates people who understand this business from people who just love whiskey. The price of getting in and the profitability of what you're building are two completely different numbers. Spending $4 million does not buy you a $4 million a year business. It buys you the right to start losing money for several years while your inventory ages. Cheap entry is cheap for a reason, and expensive entry is not a guarantee of anything. The money you spend to open the door tells you almost nothing about the money that will come back through it. Now, here's the section nobody budgets for. The hidden infrastructure. These are the costs that don't show up in the fantasy, and every single one of them is real, recurring, and non-negotiable. First, licensing and compliance. Before you distill a single drop, you need a federal permit from the Alcohol and Tobacco Tax and Trade Bureau, the TTB, to operate what they call a distilled spirits plant. You need a distilled spirits bond to cover the taxes you'll owe. You need state licensing on top of that, and in many states the rules were written before craft distilling existed, so they're a maze. Realistically, you're looking at $15,000 to $30,000 in federal, state, and local licensing and legal work just to be allowed to turn the still on. And that's before you sell anything. That's just permission. Second, the building and the build-out. A distillery is an industrial facility. You need three-phase power for the equipment, serious plumbing, drainage, ventilation, and fire protection, because you are, let's be honest, storing thousands of gallons of a substance that is legally classified as flammable. Renovating a space to handle all of that routinely runs $200,000 and up before you've hung a single sign. Third, and this is the one that quietly wrecks people, the barrels and the warehouse to hold them. A new charred American white oak barrel, the 53-gallon standard the bourbon industry runs on, costs somewhere in the range of $150 to $250 each, and you need hundreds or thousands of them. To give you a sense of the scale, the Kentucky Distillers Association reported that its members spent more than $700 million purchasing barrels in a single year. $700 million. On wooden containers. And then you need a climate-considered warehouse, a rickhouse, to store all of those barrels for years while they age. That's a building whose entire job is to hold inventory you can't sell yet. Fourth, working capital. And this is the big one, because everything I just described, the still, the building, the barrels, is money going out. But the whiskey isn't coming back for years. So you need enough cash in the bank to survive that gap. Consultants building realistic plans routinely budget 2 full years of operating expenses, $200,000 and up, just as a buffer, plus a contingency on top of that. You are, in effect, funding a business that has decided not to earn meaningful revenue for a long time on purpose. So far, so good. Painful, but manageable, if you've got the capital. Now here's where it gets genuinely strange, because this is the mechanism at the center of the entire business, and it's the thing almost nobody outside the industry truly understands. When you fill a barrel with whiskey and put it in the warehouse to age, the whiskey does not just sit there safely. It leaves. A portion of it evaporates straight through the wood and disappears into the air, every year, for the entire time it ages. The industry has a lovely, almost poetic name for this. They call it the angel's share. Let me tell you what the angel's share actually costs you. According to producers and warehouse data across the industry, in a cool, damp climate like Scotland, you lose roughly 2% of the volume in a barrel per year. In the hot, dry rickhouses of Kentucky, it's commonly 4% or more per year, and it can be higher on the top floors where the heat is worst. In extreme climates, distilleries in India and Taiwan have reported losing 10 to 15% a year. Now do the math with me, because this is the part that should make you sit up. If you're aging bourbon in Kentucky and losing 4% a year, and you age it for, say, 8 years, you don't lose 32%. It compounds, 4% of a shrinking amount, every year. By the time a well-aged whiskey is ready to bottle 10 years later, it's completely normal to have lost 20, 30, even 40% of the liquid you originally put in the barrel. Let that land for a moment. The single most valuable thing you own, aged whiskey, is evaporating. The longer you hold it to make it more valuable per bottle, the less of it you have to sell. Older whiskey commands higher prices precisely because there is physically less of it left. When you pay a premium for a 12-year bourbon, you are partly paying for everything the angels already took. The aging that makes the product special is the same process that destroys your inventory. You cannot have one without the other. So here's the reframe. Whiskey is not a product you manufacture and store. It's a product that manufactures itself slowly while simultaneously stealing from you. Your warehouse is not a safe. It's a leaking bucket that you are betting will be worth more empty than it was full. Okay, so how does money actually come back in? Because it does, but it comes in layers, and the order matters enormously. The first layer, for most successful craft distilleries, is the tasting room and direct sales. This is the bottle you sell to a person standing in front of you, and it's the most profitable dollar in the entire business, because you capture the full retail price instead of splitting it with a distributor and a store. A cocktail poured at your own bar, a bottle sold off your own shelf, a branded glass and a t-shirt, this is high-margin cash, and crucially, it comes in today, not in 5 years. For a lot of small distilleries, the tasting room is quietly the only thing keeping the lights on while the whiskey ages. The second layer is wholesale and distribution, getting your bottles onto the shelves of liquor stores and the back bars of restaurants across your state and beyond. This is how you get volume. But in most of the United States, you are legally required to sell through a 3-tier system: producer, then distributor, then retailer. You cannot skip the middle. And the distributor takes their cut, and the retailer takes theirs, so the bottle that sells for $40 on a shelf might only send 15 or 20 back to you. Volume, but thinner margins. The third layer, and this is the fast cash lifeline, is Unaged and quick-turn products. Gin, vodka, a white whiskey, a seasonal release. These let you generate revenue while your brown spirits are still sleeping in the barrel. A lot of whiskey distilleries are secretly gin distilleries for their first few years, just to survive. And the fourth layer, the one the sophisticated operators understand, is selling the aging whiskey itself as an asset. Bulk sales of barrels to other brands. Contract distilling for someone else. We'll get deep into that in a minute, because it's where the real money often hides. Now, let's talk about the recurring bleed. The operating costs. Because even after you've built everything, the money never stops going out. There's the grain, the corn, rye, wheat, and barley you buy by the ton, at prices that swing with the commodity markets. There's energy, and a lot of it, because distillation is essentially controlled boiling. You are heating enormous volumes of liquid to precise temperatures, over and over, and cooling them back down. Utilities on an industrial still are not a rounding error, they're a major monthly line. There's labor-skilled distillers, cellar workers, bottling staff, tasting room staff. There's the endless maintenance, because copper stills and pumps and boilers wear out and break. There's insurance, and it's expensive, because again, you are running a warehouse full of flammable liquid. And then there's tax, and this is where whiskey is genuinely one of the most heavily taxed products in America. The federal government charges a distilled spirits excise tax of $13.50 per proof gallon, a proof gallon being 1 gallon of spirit at 100 proof. According to the Distilled Spirits Council, distillers paid roughly $6.5 billion in federal excise taxes in a single year, and more than half the price of a typical bottle of spirits goes to a tax of some kind. Now, there is real relief for small producers. Under the Craft Beverage Modernization Act, that federal rate drops to just $2.70 per proof gallon on the first 100,000 proof gallons. That reduced rate is a genuine lifeline for craft distillers, and it's the difference between viable and hopeless for a lot of them. But here's a tax almost nobody outside the industry has ever heard of. In Kentucky, the heart of American whiskey, there is a property tax on the barrels of whiskey while they age. Kentucky is, as the Kentucky Distillers Association puts it, the only place in the world that taxes aging barrels of spirits. And it is not small. Distillers paid an all-time high of $75 million in taxes on aging barrels in a single recent year, a figure that had surged more than 160% in 5 years. Think about what that means. You are being taxed every year on inventory you have not sold and cannot sell yet, inventory that is literally evaporating while you're taxed on it. So now let's talk about the thing that can break the whole model. The risk. And with whiskey, the risk isn't a single event. It's a cycle. Here's the mechanic. Whiskey takes years to make. Demand can change in months. Those two facts do not get along. Picture what happens in a boom. Whiskey gets hot. Prices rise, allocations sell out, everybody wants in. So distilleries do the rational thing. They fill more barrels, planning for the demand they see today. But that whiskey won't be ready for 4, 6, 8 years. So you have an entire industry laying down enormous inventory based on a demand curve they're guessing will still be there when the whiskey matures. Now fast forward. The barrels come of age. But by the time they're ready, the world has changed. Younger consumers are drinking less alcohol overall. The economy softens. Tastes shift. And suddenly all of that whiskey that got laid down during the boom is coming due at exactly the moment demand is cooling. Now you have a glut, far more aged whiskey than the market wants. And this isn't hypothetical. As of recently, the industry has been staring at a bourbon surplus estimated at more than 16 million barrels, with the tax-assessed value of all the barrels aging in Kentucky hitting a record $10 billion, a mountain of inventory arriving into a market where demand is actually falling. That is the trap of the aging cycle. You commit years in advance, and the market gets a vote at the end that you don't get to see when you place the bet. Which brings us to the real story, because I want to tell you about a distillery that did almost everything right and still didn't make it. Westward Whiskey, out of Portland, Oregon. This was not a fly-by-night operation. This was, by wide agreement, one of the best American single malt distilleries in the country. They made their whiskey the hard way, American single malt, brewed almost like a craft beer, distilled and aged with genuine care. Critics loved it. It won awards. It built a reputation as a flagship of the entire American single malt movement, the kind of brand that got written up as proof that the United States could make world-class whiskey. And it wasn't undercapitalized in the way a garage startup is. It attracted serious backing, including investment tied to Diageo, one of the largest drinks companies on earth, through its craft spirits arm. Great product. Real money. Critical acclaim. Everything the fantasy says you need. And in April of 2025, Westward Whiskey filed for bankruptcy. Let that sit for a second, because it breaks the story we tell ourselves. It wasn't that the whiskey was bad. The whiskey was excellent. It was that the economics of aged spirits are merciless, and being good is not the same as being solvent. They were caught in exactly the machine I just described, years of money poured into aging inventory, a heavy cost structure, and a whiskey market that turned cold right as the industry needed it to stay warm. Younger people drinking less. Big producers reporting falling revenue. Trade tensions and tariffs battering exports. A whole wave of craft distilleries, described by trade press as an industry that was withering, heading into distress at the same time. Westward wasn't alone. Kentucky bourbon distilleries like Luca Mariano went into bankruptcy carrying tens of millions in debt, sitting on thousands of unsold barrels. Here's the lesson, and it's the whole point of this video. Westward didn't fail because they made bad whiskey. They failed because a distillery is a bet on the future placed with the money of the present, and no amount of craftsmanship changes the fact that the check comes due years later, whether or not the market shows up to pay it. The quality was real. The economics didn't care. So how does anyone win at this? Because people do. And here's where it gets interesting, because the way the smart money wins is almost never the way you think. Remember that third type of distillery I mentioned at the start, the ones that don't really distill the whiskey they sell? Here's the reveal. There is a company called MGP Ingredients, based in Lawrenceburg, Indiana, and it is the largest contract whiskey distiller in the world. MGP makes bourbon and rye in enormous industrial volumes, and then sells that aged spirit in bulk to other companies, who bottle it, put their own name and their own heartfelt origin story on the label, and sell it to you as craft. Industry writers have documented that MGP has been the actual source of spirits sold under roughly 50 different brand names. Many of the small batch, handcrafted whiskeys you've admired on a shelf were made in the same giant Indiana facility. Now, why does this matter for the economics? Because it reveals where the leverage actually is. Making the liquid is a capital-intensive, low-margin, industrial business, and MGP does it at a scale no craft distiller can touch. The margin, the brand, the story, the premium, that lives in the bottling and the marketing, not in the copper still. The romantic part of the business, the actual distilling, is the commodity. The unglamorous part, sourcing, blending, branding, and selling, is where the money often is. And the truly sophisticated owners understand a second thing. That warehouse of aging barrels isn't just inventory. It's an appreciating, tradable asset. Barrels of well-made whiskey can be sold, borrowed against, and speculated on. Whiskey aging in a rickhouse behaves a little like real estate. It can gain value over time, it can be leveraged, and in the right structure it comes with meaningful tax and depreciation advantages on the equipment and the facility. The wealthy operators aren't betting on a single great year. They're playing appreciation, diversification, and the balance sheet. They win on the asset, not the poor. So the deeper game isn't make great whiskey and sell it. It's control the parts of the chain where the margin actually lives, treat your aging inventory as a financial asset rather than just a product, and survive the cycle long enough that time does the work for you. The craft distiller falls in love with the still. The operator who lasts falls in love with the warehouse and the spreadsheet. Let me leave you with two versions of the same distillery, same barrels, same building, 2 different years. The good year. The whiskey market is hot. Your aged stock finally comes of age right as demand peaks. Your tasting room is packed every weekend, throwing off high-margin cash. Your bottles are allocated, meaning stores get less than they want and customers pay a premium and buy fast. You sell some barrels in bulk to a brand that's short on aged stock, and they pay handsomely for the years you already put in. The value of the inventory still sleeping in your warehouse has climbed. On paper and in the bank, you are, finally, years in, a real business making real money. This is the year that ends up in the magazine profile. The bad year. Same warehouse. But now there's a glut, millions of surplus barrels sitting across the industry, and yours are competing with all of them. Demand has cooled, younger drinkers are buying less, exports are getting hit by tariffs. The whiskey you laid down 4 years ago in optimism is coming due into a market that doesn't want it at the price you need. Meanwhile, the Angel's share took its cut anyway. You have less liquid to sell than you filled. The barrel tax came due on inventory you couldn't move. The excise tax, the utilities, the labor, the insurance, the loan payments, none of them paused just because sales did. And the tasting room, your one reliable stream, is quieter because people are spending less. Nothing about the building changed. The whiskey is just as good. But the machine that felt like a money printer in the good year is now, in the bad year, a warehouse full of taxed, evaporating inventory you're paying to hold and struggling to sell. That's the year that ends in a bankruptcy filing, the way it did for a distillery that made some of the best whiskey in America. Same barrels. Same still. Same skill. The only thing that changed was time and the market, the two variables you bet on years earlier and never got to control. So go back to the beginning. Back to that warm brick building, the copper still catching the afternoon light, your hand on a barrel you're sure is turning clear liquid into money while you sleep. Look at it again now. The still isn't the business. Distilling the liquid is the easy, commodity part. A giant plant in Indiana does it cheaper and better than you ever will. The tasting room pays the bills, but it's not the prize. The prize, and the peril, is that leaking bucket of a warehouse. Years of your money poured into barrels that evaporate, get taxed while they sit, and only pay off if a market you can't see today decides to show up years from now. The whiskey isn't really the business. The weight is.